Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Yarnott. I am the Windows product owner for a large international manufacturing firm whose primary line of business is not computer related. I'm going to be talking about blocking group policy during task sequences. I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. Back in 2009, right before Windows 7 came out, I was working with the MDT trying to replace the existing OS deployment system that we had that was custom and entirely built in-house, and replace it with the MDT, which was from Microsoft. It was an evolution of the BDD. And I spent much of my Christmas vacation getting it in place and ready to go, so on January 1st we could start deploying Windows 7 clients in our environment. Now, as is to be expected, being a large manufacturing firm whose focus was, well, not OS deployment and not being current on the edge of technology, my efforts, while heroic, were met with pretty much no response at all. We had a functioning build process based on MDT, and pretty much nobody was using it. So I got it in place, made it available to the build rooms, and hurried up and waited while people continued to build Windows XP systems using our old proprietary system. Flash forward a few months, we started having some issues where applications that people wanted to use in our environment couldn't work on the old, ancient, decrepit OS that was XP. So around March of 2010, some areas were starting to get interested in building Windows 7. Of course, I hadn't touched it in a few months, and then all of a sudden I start getting these phone calls. Steve, it's not working. Well, define it's not working. And I would have customers who would call me up and be looking at screens such as this one. I'm going to go ahead and resume it. This was from a build, and they would get a screen very much like this. Okay. And let's see if I can get Zoom it to work. Okay, try that again. There we go. So yeah, they'd be looking at this, and they'd say, well, it got to this, and I assumed the build was done, so I packed it up and I shipped it off to the end user's desk. And when it got there, it wasn't really done, because, of course, it's sitting on the legal notice caption, which is a MDT killer. So, I'm going to go ahead and just log into this machine, and just by clicking OK, because I didn't change the password or anything. And it's going to pick up and continue building from that point. So what we had was build rooms were delivering machines that weren't even done yet being built. And then there were additional other things that were going on that was even worse. And so it had built, it had joined the domain, and it wasn't completely done. And so it had to continue building from that point forward. So I didn't have this experience when I was building my stuff in the lab, and of course, because nobody was using it, I didn't get that external validation that stuff wasn't quite complete, wasn't quite working. And so I had to then later develop, well, how do I fix this? Now, as I'd said, I work for a very large international manufacturing firm. I don't have control over all of the OUs. How many of you out there have absolute control over everything IT? You are few. You are rare. Most of us are contending with a lot of different personalities, a lot of different attitudes, and a lot of different, albeit valid, ideas about how to administer things. My particular situation was, because we were so big, I'm fighting language barriers. And in my case, language barrier could be English to Japanese. A language barrier could be individual end user to IT. Language barrier could be management to IT. So group policy itself has the capability of disrupting NBT task sequences. There are certain things that are always problems that will break MDT cold. It will stop it, and MDT will then have to be kick-started to continue on. The legal notice or the auto run is disallowed. That will stop MDT. If auto run is disallowed by your group policy, which is probably a very good idea in a lot of areas. At the same time, it's going to break MDT. If you have scripts or executables that are denied access to running, that will break MDT because, well, MDT is simply just a large collection of scripts. Or the local administrator account. This is one of my favorites. You disallow it or change it in some way. Stops MDT cold dead in its tracks. And then there's another kind of problem that is not quite as bad, but it definitely complicates things. Because there are sometimes, or intermittent problems, where you'll have this case where it will stumble over it, and it might work sometimes and might not work others. And then so advertised software and software restrictions fall under that category, where they can cause you problems and potentially and give you a build quality issue. So as I had already showed you, we had that part where MDT was blocked by group policy. And what happens is then the customer gets an incomplete build when it arrives at their desk. Sometimes the machine will pick up and continue on from that point when it gets to the customer's desk. And other times, it's just not really done. Things aren't quite right. Some of the settings didn't make it. Some of the software, maybe if you've got software that depends on being in the domain, it didn't get installed. And so this is an incomplete build. It's a big quality issue, and you certainly don't want to be delivering machines like that. So I showed you the legal notice. Basically, if you want to be able to read it, it says, a lawyer somewhere decided that this notice that nobody really reads somehow obligates you to all kinds of legal ramifications were you to do something bad with this machine. How many people have companies that make them do this? Yeah. Your company probably makes you add such a legal notice to your machines by way of group policy object. Irrespective of whether or not it has any impact on the behavior of your end users, such a group policy object will absolutely halt automatic logins and interrupt the automation of MDT task sequences. There are other ways to handle this, by the way. My method is not the only way. One very valid way, if you have enough control, is to use staging OUs. You place the machine into an OU that doesn't have any group policies on it, and then after the build is done, move it. But you might not have that as an option. And so, another one, software restriction policies. You get this lovely error that says, execution of the Windows script host failed. This program is blocked by group policy. Well, guess what? The Windows script host is what MDT relies on. This is how MDT actually works. It is a large collection of WScript and WSF and HTA files. It's all knitted together in order to make a contiguous task sequence. Or somebody decides that they need to rename the local administrator account because our corporate policy says that the name administrator is too obvious. Everybody uses that, so let's change it. By the way, this doesn't really help because it's a well-known SID, and people can just look it up. But if you rename the local administrator account or disable the local administrator account, you'll get an error like this. Light touch deployment failed. And your build will have halted at the point where it reaches where group policy is in effect. And then, of course, if you got a script, and actually in my demonstration environment, I actually have such a script where we have a group policy object that illustrates such a horribly bad idea. So it helps if I go to group policy. And, group policy. And let's see, change local administrator password, edit. And I'm just going to drill down to the software or Windows settings, scripts, the startup script. Nice simple startup script. By the way, don't ever do this. You'll notice what I called the script's name is bad idea. So it's a bad idea to do this, but just show you how to do it if you ever wanted to do it. Simply run net user administrator, bad place to put a password. And the reason this is a really bad idea is because anybody who can log into the domain can read the contents of group policy unless you take special steps to prevent it. So in the event that one of your administrators has thought they're really sneaky and sly and has decided to change their your passwords that way, this is what you're going to get. And MDT, again, comes to a dead halt. Now, it might be your plan to take over the world and to become the guy over there in that corner who actually has full administrative authority over his entire environment in IT. But the odds of you being able to do that, the larger your company is, are very slim. So there might be a better way. Maybe there's another way. And in that particular case is to actually block group policy processing during the MDT task sequence. As of Vista, group policy is managed by the group policy processing client. It is a protected service. Microsoft really thought that, hey, it would be a good idea to keep people from mucking these things up. And of course, what I'm proposing is that we muck it up temporarily. Group policy is a great way to manage settings. Unfortunately, great ways don't always agree with each other. MDT is really good, group policy is really good, and most of the time they work very well together, except during this one particular piece of time. So you want to be able to temporarily turn off group policy processing service. And because it is a protected service, it has some natural obstacles. They don't want you messing with these services. So in order to prevent you from doing that, they gave administrators essentially read-only access. So we have to do something to be able to do something about that. Anything we do to the group policy processing service before the build is completely done, we need to undo because, well, as you all would agree, group policy is a really good thing. But additionally, it's kind of interesting to know, definitely true on Windows 7, I'm pretty sure it's true on Vista, you cannot log in with a domain account on a machine that has group policy processing service disabled. It won't let you. There is a netlogon dependency on that service. So if you turn it off, you have to turn it back on. So by default, group policy processing service looks like this. If you look at the registry, its start type is set to 2, and it's got some permissions. I'm going to actually switch over to the demonstration machine and look at it live. Looking at it on a machine that is already, that's the 2012 one. I'm just going to go ahead and look at it on my domain controller, because that's fun. Going to regedit and go to the service, HKey local machine, software, or no, excuse me, not software, system, current control set, services, GP SVC, and you'll notice that Zoom it doesn't work as well as I'd like it to. That its start type is set to 2. And then if you look at the permissions, administrators have only special permissions. The system has full control, but the administrators have only special. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the advanced and see what kind of permissions that the administrators have. Well, they have query value, enumerate subkeys, notify, create link, and read control on this key only, and a similar set on subkeys, query value, enumerate subkeys, notify, and read control on subkeys. Essentially, that's a glorified version of read-only. And of course, the system itself has full control over that key. Many of the protected services are set up like that, and in order to manipulate that, we need to be able to change the DACL so that we can read and alter that key. So my proposal, or the problem, of course, it's critical. We have to have this service. But at the same time, this very same service gets in the way of us building our machines without any hiccups. So we have to give ourselves the permissions. Because we're administrators at that point in time in the MDT, we can do this, then disable it, and then join the domain. At the end of the task sequence, we should undo all of the damage that we've done. So first, we have to gracefully remove the protections. It takes 3 basic steps. The first step is to take the ownership of the key. Then we give the administrators full control of the key. If we try to do those in opposite order, it will not work. And then we set the start value to 4, which is disabled in service speak. It should be done after the operating system has been installed, up to and any time up to and including right before the recover from domain action. So right before you join the domain, anytime after you've installed the OS, right before you join the domain. I have 2 methods for this. One of them is fully vetted, been using it for 2 years. The other one I'm still developing a little bit. The method I've used for MDT 2010 was using a program called setACL. It's written by Helga Klein. I've got it linked in my slide deck. And I created a group that allows you to disable it using those 3 steps, each step with an independent task sequence item in a group. The first item is quite simply using setACL to set the administrators as the owner of the key. The line looks like this. And again, this is linked in my slide deck, so you don't have to actually write it all down. setACL, on HK local machine, system, current control set, services, GP service. We're doing a registry action. We're setting the owner, and we're setting the owner to S-1-5-32-544, which, as I previously stated, is the group for administrators. And it's the same on every language of every OS. So if you're running a Portuguese version of the OS, you're running a Chinese version of the OS, this command works regardless of the language, which is good for me because then I didn't have to look up how do you spell administrators in Chinese. It's kind of challenging for me. I don't speak Chinese, and I certainly don't know how to spell things in Chinese. The second step, a little easier. Using setACL again, I grant administrators, that same SID makes another appearance, full control of that key and all subkeys. And then, of course, the last step is very easy. It's just a simple registry edit. Oh. And one of my screenshots on the other side is actually the wrong screenshot. The code is right, the screenshot is wrong. So we add HK local machine. They set the start value to 4. So that's the disabling action. And then I've also created a PowerShell method for MDT 2012. It is a single line. Disable the group policy processing client, and it runs a PowerShell script that does exactly the same thing. The disable the group policy processing client piece is working perfectly. It operates exactly the same way as the MDT 2010 method. The restore piece is being a little problematic. I'm having a challenging time giving the ownership back to system. I can set the rights properly. I can set the start type properly, but the ownership question, PowerShell doesn't want to do that, or at least my method for using PowerShell doesn't want to do that. And so, hence, later on this week, I'm going to be going to a PowerShell guru and having him look over my code to see if I can fix it before I publish it up to the web. In MDT 2012, which, by the way, if you're not aware, went public yesterday. They actually updated 2012. It is now no longer a release candidate or beta. It is available as of yesterday. You can use PowerShell scripts as part of the task sequence. And because the basic steps are the same, we can do it in a single PS1 script. It's much easier to read in your task sequence because it's a single line item and works as of MDT 2012 and forward. So if you're using 2010, you have to use the setACL method. The setACL method also works in MDT 2012. But rolling forward, my plan, once I get the restore portion working perfectly, is to use PowerShell exclusively and not use the third-party tool. And the reverse is also only a single script, but as I said, I'm still having a little bit of issues with it. The actual putting it into the MDT, it's a simple one-liner. Run the script, %scriptroot / disable GP service PS1. During the task sequence execution, the wrapper that they built into MDT takes care of the set execution policy, so you don't have to worry about that. It invokes it, elevates it, and then processes it, and then sets the execution policy back to the way it comes by default. Much easier to read from a code perspective, and also makes a lot of your stuff a lot more portable. And of course, the restore, when it's working, will be the exact opposite, restore GP service.ps1. As it currently stands, the script that I have works to the point where the end user doesn't know anything's wrong. There's a registry key out there that administrators are still the owner of. I don't feel terribly comfortable with that. So I want to make it so it's back the way it's supposed to be. So I'm not yet using this in my production environment. I am using the 2010 method still in my company. So in order to stop it with PowerShell, we have to talk about how the PowerShell actually reads. So I'm going to go view my domain controller, go to the actual PowerShell script, which is currently in my tools folder. So go to the MDT, go to the tools, go to the x64 folder, and I'm using the x64 version, so heck. So disable. Oh, maybe I'm not. Oh, ha, because it's not my tools folder, it's my scripts folder, because I referenced the scripts folder, didn't I? Disable GP service. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this. I'm going to edit it with Notepad just because it marks it up and makes it a lot easier to read. You'll notice that I'm going to scroll through the script really quick. A lot of it is comments. Talks about how it does it. This first section is a function that I found online. I reference it in the post right here, that does a really good job of taking ownership. Rather than write my own, I figured let's repurpose somebody else's code. So that first function is, how do I actually secure ownership of an object? And I execute that function. So essentially, I grab a blank ACL off of the registry key. I get the access, so I get a blank ACL here in this line. I get the principal security identifier for the administrators group, which I've identified by SID, so I can make sure that this works on any language or any OS where somebody's actually changed the name of the administrators group. It doesn't matter. I don't have to look up the name of the administrators group. I am looking directly at it by SID. I pull back the security principal for that object. Then I set the ownership of that object, or that principal, as the owner of the registry key that I pulled back, and then I write it back to the key. So that was step one, right there, is those 4 lines, and those 4 lines are using the function above. So after I've gotten the ownership, I then pick up the actual access control list of the object. I give the admins group, which I'd previously determined the security principal for, full control, and propagate the inheritance downward. I set the access rule as part of the rule, and then I write it back to the key. And then I close the key to write it out. I then go in and, as my last step, and this is all documented in the script itself, I set the start value to 4. It's a fairly simple script. There's a lot of the function up above, a lot of comments within it, and it's available as up on a website that I will link to from my slide deck. So, how do I know if it works? Well, proof of success in this particular case is actually an error. Because what will happen when you succeed at the next boot is you will see a little toast window pop up near the clock that says, I failed to connect to a Windows service. Because this is what we're actually trying to do, this error is proof of success. We've successfully disabled the group policy processing service, and so it's yelling at us about it. And so if you do this in your environment, the build technicians will call you and say, I'm getting this error. And you have to turn around and tell them that's a good thing, because if you didn't get that error, there would be other problems. This error will go away and it's transient, don't worry about it, it's part of the build. It means you successfully disabled the service. And if you're running in other languages, it looks different, but essentially it says the same thing. I have on the screen the Portuguese, the German, and the Japanese versions of the error message. All it means is that you have succeeded in disabling group policy processing. The rest of your task sequence can continue on without any problems. So at that point, now that we've disabled the group policy processing service, we continue on with the other steps. What you'll do at this point in time is install software that requires the domain. Anybody have some domain link software where it has to add an account or be part of a specific OU in order to be configured properly? That's when you would do this. I've joined the domain. Now I install that domain-dependent software. If you want to configure groups, I want to add a bunch of administrative groups or put people in the power users groups, or even better, restrict people from being in those groups. You can configure your groups right then. And if you have the configuration of domain-dependent groups or software, you can do it at that point in time. And then, of course, at the end, we have to turn around and undo the damage. My recommendation is that if you are disabling it, do everything you can to put it back exactly the way Microsoft produced it in the first place. On my setACL method for 2010, I've got that down. It works the way it's supposed to. On the PowerShell 2012 method, I'm not quite there yet. Still working it. So, first item, and doing it in reverse order, closely to reverse order is the way you want to go. So you set the start value to 2. Then actually, instead of, my slides are slightly inaccurate here, you don't set the administrators group back to the correct permissions. What you do is you set the ownership, and because you already have full control, you can then change the ACLs after you set ownership. If you do it in the other order, you won't be able to set ownership. So you return the key ownership to the system, and then you set the ACLs back the way you found them. And then if you don't have a reboot as the exit event of your task sequence, force a reboot or do an action that will drive a reboot at that time. The setACL method. I'll just go ahead and show it to you on the task sequence. Helps if I'm looking at the right server. There we go. Go to my MDT. Go to my task sequences. And I have single image with 2010 style, GP service block, and BG info, and then, of course, my 2012 style one. 2010 style, got my initialization, MMS BIOS settings, validation. Happens after install. It's a post-install action. Or actually, it occurs during state restore, and I've got a group for it, so I'll get down to that group. There we go. Disable group policy processing service. Disable step 1. Okay, so here's the disable, and then the enable down here at the bottom. So restore step 1. We're going to add, or actually edit the start value back to 2. Restore step 2. We set the administrators group back to read. And you can get really specific and actually do, using setACL, you can get extremely specific and not just give them read, but give them exactly the rights they had before. setACL will let you export it, export the existing settings in SDDL, but for expediency, I just set it to read during this presentation. And then you set the ownership back to system. And this is something where setACL can do it. It will allow you to set the owner back to a specific SID. I'm having a little trouble getting PowerShell to do it, so I'm going to be, again, seeking the help of the PowerShell guys to see if they can help me figure out what's going wrong. Then for the 2012 style, task sequence are much simpler. Single line item. Restore group policy processing service, PowerShell code. Once that's fully functional, it'll be published on my website. The existing one does everything but correctly restore the ownership of that key. So. And this is what I just showed you. So this is a little easier way to read it. Setting start type back to automatic. Just giving it a value of 2, the data of 2 down at the bottom, forcing it. Giving administrators read with setACL. And setting the ownership back to system with setACL. Slightly different order, but it's a nice, simple task sequence. And then the PowerShell method is quite simply just a single entry for PowerShell. On the PowerShell itself, its current status, show you the part that is actually having problems. Same function as before, used for setting ownership. Nearly the same code, except this time, this is the item that appeared last. It's now appearing first. I'm setting a value right off the bat. I'm identifying the security principal for the administrators group. I'm setting them to query values, setting that as the access rule for them, and then here's the piece that's not quite working. When I run it with this piece not commented out, it says I'm not allowed to change the ownership to that ID. PowerShell doesn't want to give that privilege to the system. So again, I'm going to be talking with the PowerShell guys to see if they can help me out and tell me what am I doing wrong. Could just be a simple, very simple edit that fixes this, but once that's fixed, it will be part of the scripts I publish up on the web. Same code, just looked at it. And it's a single action in PowerShell. So during the task sequence, this is the way it actually looks. I've got a machine paused right at the point of actually doing it. I'm going to go ahead and launch it. And it's near that point in the build process. Go ahead and show you where it's at on the this? This is build client 2, build client 1. It's running this one. And it just did that restart right there. So go ahead and bring it on screen. And you can follow along on the script along the side to know what it's doing. If it ever actually boots. There we go. Starting to worry. In case you're wondering, the wallpaper is done by BG Info. This is a feature that I was attempting to talk about yesterday when my routing on my internal network on my Hyper-V session wasn't quite working right. It's working now. I'm going to move that down just a little bit so it's not cut off at the top. There we go. It is running. It's just kind of slow because this is a system that's... There we go. So there it's launched the Disable the Group Policy Processing client. I'm running the release candidate of MDT 2012. This step takes an unusually long amount of time, and so when I was watching it do this, I was sitting there thinking, well, you know, that's a problem. That's going to actually cause me some trouble. And then I realized a lot of the steps happen so quickly you can't even talk about them. So it's actually kind of nice in the sense that, hey, I get a chance to say it's on screen. You saw it. It said it Disable Group Policy Processing Service. That's it running the PowerShell script. Now it's doing a reboot because it just joined the domain. And if all goes well, we'll have a little error down in the lower right-hand corner shortly after it boots that says, I can't talk to group policy processing. This is sadness. In our case, it's not really sadness because this is what we want to have happen. Logs in. Kind of like watching paint dry. How many of you live to watch reboots happen? Your Windows administrators, come on, you should all be raising your hands. Reboots are good. And so there we have the actual error message that we're looking for. This is what we want. We want this. If I hover over that, it says failed to connect to a Windows service, and if I actually put my mouse on it, but it's there and then it's gone because it's got another reboot action in there where it's doing other things. So we've successfully navigated the recovery from the domain. It's now going to be doing the subject of my yesterday's presentation, which is to actually construct a login wallpaper for the people that are logging in. Boy, wouldn't it have been nice if I was able to show this yesterday. And then it's going to do some more software installs, and then it'll get down to the bottom where it does the restore user state and then exits out of the build process. Again, because it's still disabled, it's going to be yelling at the end customer. Of course, this end customer is actually the build technician, and he's busy ignoring this machine and all the others that are next to it that he's building at the same time. So it's creating that login wallpaper, running the restore user state action. Eventually, it's going to get down to these other steps. The ZTI final config, I haven't quite gotten it prettied up like I had the others prettied up. But now it's running the restore the group policy processing client. In this particular case, it's not restoring ownership to the system. So it's not feature complete, but it's getting there. And then after it does that, it will get to the point where it runs final configuration. This is a script that Michael Nydstrom wrote. I tweaked it a little bit to make it fit the look and feel of all of my other dialogues, and of course didn't quite do that right, so it's not finding its graphics. But at the end, it does a few it's exited the task sequence at this point, or at least it thinks it has, and it's verifying that that's done, and it's doing a little post-apply cleanup where it's going to be deleting the mini-NT directory and making sure all of the scripts are in one directory. Or not the scripts, but the log files are all in one directory. After it does this, it will reboot, and it'll be ready for the end user to actually log in. If the restore group policy processing service has gone well, end users can actually log in. If it hasn't gone well, it won't be able to. We'll go ahead and log in as a domain user after it finally gets through. What it's doing right now is actually checking to see if the task sequence is still running. It just keeps doing that until it doesn't get an answer anymore, which it just did. And then when it no longer gets that answer, it sets the machine to reboot. So this action does a reboot as part of its last item. And then the machine will be ready for end user use. So waiting for it to finish the reboot. And there's the background wallpaper that we configured on the fly. Got the machine name, the domain, service tag of the machine, which in the case of a virtual machine is a horrendously long string. In the case of most hardware, it's reasonably short. Now, what drove me to doing all of this was quite simply the fact that there is a very large organization I work for, and that I did not have the level of control that would be necessary to direct the individual local locations. No, you can't do that with group policy. It's breaking my builds. I don't want you to do that. You're stepping on my toes. It was easier for me to come up with a way to have my toes not be where they could be stepped on, instead of trying to have that communication with each individual location. Currently, I have 221 selection profiles, incorporating 14 languages and 880 different OUs to go to. Very hard to get a handle around all of that when it's easier just to remove the problem. So now we're at a point where I can actually go to the machine and log in and hit Control-Alt-Delete. I've got this legal notice that would have gotten in my way. I go to the point where I log in, MMS user, and the password I gave it, which was test.123. Logging in for the first time as a limited user on a machine that was set up with the group policy processing blocked. If you leave it off and disabled, this login will fail, and you'll get an error message that says, no, this didn't work. You certainly don't want to do that. But if it succeeded, it would go to the point where it's at now, preparing your desktop, and launch in to where the person is seeing the desktop that they expect. They've got their data, they get their group policy is in place, and everything works as it should. So they get their default wallpaper, it's all pretty, and the machine is ready for the end user to use. Here in a moment, if you attended yesterday's session that failed miserably, you'll actually get to see the part that didn't work yesterday work, if it ever gets around to it. And now it's created a custom wallpaper based on that specific machine, displaying some key information about the machine, and set up in such a way that the end user can, with a simple keystroke, refresh the data when they call the help desk to say something isn't working, avoiding that very discussion where the help desk has to walk the person who doesn't know what a command prompt is through to getting their IP address. Who's ever had that communication? You ever had the really long and painful conversation? Press the Windows key. No, it's the key next to the Alt and the Control button. Now, hold that down and press the letter R. It takes a very long time to get through that conversation. So, it worked. Now, because we were using the 2012 version, if I go to regedit, which is going to say, hey, you can't do that. Or actually, no, it's going to let me do it. It's just not going to change anything, which is fine. I don't need to change anything. System, current control set, services, GP service. And I can see that its start type is set to 2. But as I had previously mentioned, the owner of the account is still set to administrators, which is not the way it should be. This should be system. But that's because the PowerShell is not quite there yet. Will be shortly, it's just not there yet. So that part is working up to the part where it doesn't restore ownership to the system. Any questions? Ran a little fast, but yes. Could you come to one of the mics to ask the question?
Can't you use the system account just to make the registry key?
I'm sorry, what?
Can't you just use the system account, say via scheduled tasks, just to make the registry change to and from disabled?
Can't I schedule a task? Probably, but again, you'd have to know exactly how do I return ownership to something.
Well, you wouldn't have to return the ownership if you ran it as system to change the service to disabled and then ran it as system to change it back. You wouldn't have to worry about changing permissions or ownership.
That is a possible solution. I'll investigate it. I hadn't considered that. Since during the task sequence you're running as the local administrator, that would involve adding the complexity of setting up a scheduled task during the process. So it may be 6 of one, half a dozen the other, and with all things Windows, there might be more than one way to solve the same problem. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I'll give it a look, but I had definitely not. That's a very good suggestion. Thank you. Any other questions?
Any reason you don't disable the balloon tips just from the registry key, just to stop that error message coming up and confusing admins?
You could absolutely do that. Disable the balloon tips. There's absolutely no reason not to. In my particular case, again, I'm beholden to 880 different OU administrators' opinions of how things should be, and I may be going exactly against their wishes. And so trying to keep it generic, I'm not turning off any error messages. I'm not disabling anything. Despite the fact that my task sequence is extraordinarily long, the number of actual tweaks I do to the OS are incredibly small. They're all documented as a single line item. For example, I turn on Quick Edit for the local administrator account. I turn that on. That's one small tweak I do to every machine that's built. And the simple reason being is that if I'm troubleshooting somebody else's machine, I don't want to have to go through the dance of doing some of these things. I give the command prompt a really long history. I make hidden objects not so hidden. I put in the environment variable dev manager show non-present devices. So these things are there in every local administrator account on every machine at my company. But there's really not that many tweaks I do to the normal typical end user. And simple reason being is that I don't want to get into a turf war with my group policy administrators. All of these are going to be up on the link from the slide deck. The slide deck itself is at on MMS Connect. This link here and that QR code take you to a place where I've got all of these scripts. A couple of the scripts I'm not going to publish until they're completely fully baked, but the task sequences, the PowerShell code, the proof of concept GPOs, including the one that lets you put vertical spaces in a legal notice caption. I'm kind of surprised nobody asked about that one. Are all up there, and how I actually did those things, step by step, fully documented on that website. Any other questions? I will be here and if there is. Guys, have a good day.